Thank you for attending my first program as VP of Programs for the Culver City Historical Society. Thanks to Hope for nominating me, for everyone for voting me in. In the summer of 1984, I was very prepared and excited for the Olympics. My fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Etheridge at Farragut Elementary, had an index card set of Olympic facts and trivia that I remember studying in the back of the classroom. During day games, she would let me sit at her desk and listen to Vince Scully on KABC AM radio, too. Vin, of course, was broadcasting from Dodger Stadium, where I would later attend the bronze and gold and silver medal games, though baseball was included as a demonstration sport that year. Thanks to a relative leaving Dad some inheritance, he also took me to archery, the gold medal soccer game at the Rose Bowl, where my only real memory is seeing the crowd form a simultaneous wave, two waves that crossed. That was fantastic. And qualifying heats for track and field at the Coliseum, where I saw Carl Lewis. But probably my favorite memory from the '84 Olympics is from August 5th, 1984, lining up on Jefferson Boulevard by Lakeside Villas to watch the first ever women's marathon pass through Culver City. The excitement of the people lining the sidewalk and even climbing up into trees and on light posts was palpable. I even remember a pair of small, fluffy white dogs wearing matching 1984 Olympic vests and visors that were being walked through the crowd. A few days later, on August 12, 1984, I watched the ABC broadcast of the men's marathon from the comfort of Mom's den, getting very excited when the runners rounded the turn from Playa to Overland, heading towards my house. I walked to the corner of Jefferson and Overland to watch the camera truck and the lead runners go by before going back home to watch the rest on TV. It was probably hot, I think, or I was just lazy. The only thing comparable since has been watching the O.J. low-speed chase on TV and then seeing the helicopters out the window of my Palms apartment as they followed over the 405, but that wasn't quite as magical. But of course, the 1984 Olympics weren't the first Olympics to affect Culver City. 1932 helped shape this area, and Los Angeles, of course. Culver City has long had the Western Hemisphere Marathon, and soon enough will be preparing for the 2028 Los Angeles Olympic Games. After our featured speaker, we'll have a Q&A. So if you have questions or stories or your own memories from the 32 or 84 games, I encourage you to come up and share them. Do we have any Olympians or Western Hemisphere Marathon participants with us today? If so, please stand up. Yes, all right. Please tell us your name, your sport, and the Olympics you participated in.
Jan Dalchikoff. I was born at Culver City General Hospital, where my parents met many years ago, and I was on the 76 and 80 Olympic rowing team. 76 was the inaugural year for women's rowing in the Olympic Games, and I also actually worked for the Olympic Organizing Committee in 82 to 84.
Thank you so much for coming. Do we have any volunteers, other volunteers for the 84 games here? Stand up. Oh, hell, please stand up.
Not me.
Please stand up and show us your uniform. This is fantastic. Please turn around. This is wonderful.
Okay, well, from 1984, this is the only thing that really fit. This was not quite as good, and the skirt was impossible. But I volunteered for a year, working doping control in a VIP, and just eating lunch with Peter Uberoff during the day. He was so great. Circle make around, watching Rayford Johnson light that torch, and all of it was just great. So I don't think I'll be here for the next one, but you never know.
Thank you so much. Yeah, actually, I think it was during the games I went to New York through LAX, and who did I see there but my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Etheridge, wearing that same type of uniform. I was really pleased to see her there. And so thank you very much for bringing that uniform back. And now for our speaker, our featured speaker. Wayne Wilson is a consultant to LA84 Foundation, where he served for 3 decades as Vice President for Education and was responsible for research projects, library development, and conference planning. For over 30 years, the LA84 Foundation has experienced firsthand the power of sport to change lives. The foundation's funding, focus, and advocacy has positively impacted more than 3 million underserved and under-resourced youth, supporting over 2,200 organizations and trained 80,000 coaches. With a third Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles coming in 2028, the LA84 Foundation is ready to take their work to even greater heights as they begin to build a new legacy for the next generation. Mr. Wilson, who holds a doctorate in sports studies from the University of Massachusetts, writes and speaks frequently about the Olympic movement and previously served on the Research Council of the Olympic Studies Center in Lausanne, Switzerland. He is the co-editor of Doping and Elite Sport, The Politics of Drugs in the Olympic Movement, released in the year 2000. He's the co-editor of the University of California Press book series Sport in World History, and he's co-editor of the recently released LA Sports, Play, Games, and Community in the City of Angels. It's a great book. I'll tell you about it. LA Sports brings together 16 essays covering various aspects of the development and changing nature of sport in one of America's most fascinating and famous cities. The writers cover a range of topics, including the history of car racing and ice skating, the development of sport venues, the power of the Mexican fan base in American soccer leagues, the intersecting life stories of Jackie and Mac Robinson, the importance of the Showtime Lakers, the origins of Muscle Beach and surfing, sport and Hollywood films, and, of course, the 1932 and 1984 Olympics. I was privileged to attend the book launch and unofficial retirement party for Mr. Wilson at LA84's home in West Adams. It's a great facility if you've never been, and it was touching to be a part of Mr. Wilson's send-off. Since he's retired and really didn't need to accept our invitation, we're honored and privileged to have him here tonight. Wayne Wilson.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you all for being here this evening. All right, let me get set up here. Well, as Ryan said, Los Angeles hosted both the 1932 and the 1984 Olympic Games and is scheduled to host the 2028 Games as well. Now, although the city of Los Angeles hosted the Games in 32 and 84, the footprint of those Olympic Games was much larger and went far beyond the city limits of Los Angeles. So in 1932, the competition stretched in the south from Long Beach to as far north as Moore Park and Oxnard. And in 1984, the footprint was even bigger, going from San Diego County in the south as far north as Lake Casitas and Santa Barbara County for the rowing and the kayak competitions. Culver City, however, is located right next door to Los Angeles, and so it's not surprising that the stories of the 32 and the 84 Games are intertwined with Culver City. And I would go a step further and say that Culver City also played an important role in Southern California Olympic history and the half century between those two games. So before I talk about the 32 and the 84 Games, let me set the stage. Let me set the stage. Here we go. All right. The modern Olympic movement began in the late 19th century under the leadership of a French aristocrat named Pierre de Coubertin. Yeah, a big Coubertin fan right here. So, the first modern games took place in Athens in 1896. The Athens Games were followed at 4-year intervals called Olympiads by games in Paris, St. Louis, London, and 1912, Stockholm. Because of World War I, there were no games in 1916, and then the games resumed in 1920 in Antwerp. Those games were followed by a second games in Paris in 1924, and then in 1928, Amsterdam hosted the games. So, by the time that the games got to Los Angeles, we were in the 10th Olympiad, and that is why the 10th Olympiad is why 10th Street became Olympic Boulevard, which is what we know it as today. So the effort to bring, come on up front, people, there are lots of spaces. The effort to bring the Los Angeles Games, the Olympic Games to Los Angeles began in 1919 when a group of local boosters with newspaper and real estate interests formed something called the California Fiestas Association. This was a group dedicated to promoting Los Angeles, growing Los Angeles, and among its agenda items were the creation of a large sports stadium and bringing the Olympic Games to Los Angeles. The association president was a man named William May Garland. Garland was a real estate mogul, and in 1919, he traveled to Antwerp to attend a meeting of the International Olympic Committee, where he made a pitch for Los Angeles to host the next games. The committee received him cordially, but they did point out that Paris had already been selected to host the 24 games, and that a strong commitment also had been made to Amsterdam to host the 1928 games. However, the IOC was impressed by Garland. They asked him to become a member of the committee, and they also left the door open for a future bid for Los Angeles to host the games. We doing okay? Okay. The Fiestas Association dissolved in 1920 and was reconstituted as the Community Development Association, which also continued the campaign to create a large sports stadium in Los Angeles and to bring the games to Los Angeles. And in 1923, both of those objectives were realized. The Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum opened in that year, and Garland, who at this point was an IOC member, traveled to Europe, where he again made a pitch for Los Angeles to host the games. The IOC agreed, and that is how the 32 games came to be here. Now, it's interesting to note that Garland made a pitch that was very similar to the message put forth nearly a century later by the bid committee for the Los Angeles 2024 and 2028 games. The 28 bid committee, with its sun-kissed angel and its slogan, "Follow the Sun," was selling the same thing that Garland did many years earlier, namely the beaches, the weather, and the movie industry. So the 1932 games were organized by the 10th Olympiad Committee using money from a state bond. The games ran from July 30th to August 14th. The Olympic Stadium in 32, as it was in 1984, was the Coliseum at Expo Park. And the 1932 games produced a number of Olympic firsts. For one thing, female stars for the first time in the summer game, or female athletes for the first time in the summer games were stars, and the brightest star of all, according to not just of the women, but the brightest star of all of the athletes, according to Grantland Rice, who was the leading sports writer of the day, was the woman in the middle, who was Babe Diedrichson. She was an athlete from Beaumont, Texas. She won 2 medals, 2 gold medals and 1 silver medal in track and field. 32 was also the first time that Asian athletes played a prominent role in the games. And the Japanese team, primarily on the strength of its men's swimming team, won more medals than Great Britain did and won more gold medals than Germany did. We also saw in 1932 the emergence of African-American men in track and field. It wasn't the first time that African-American men had competed in track and field, but it's the first time that they really made an impact in terms of winning medals. And we saw for the first time in the Summer Games the Olympic ceremony as we know it today. And what I mean by that is we saw for the first time athletes standing on a podium, listening to the national anthem of the gold medalist, and that event happening right after their competition. Prior to that, in the Summer Games, it had been different. And then the other really noteworthy first in 1932 was the Olympic Village. This was the first time that a real village was built. The one in 32 was built near Culver City in Baldwin Hills. That village housed the male athletes. The women were at a hotel in downtown Los Angeles called the Chapman Hotel. Now, I say Baldwin Hills, and almost every source that you will look at will say that the games were in Baldwin Hills, but to be really specific about it, the village was in the neighborhood that today we would call Windsor Hills or View Park. It was up above Stalker, and in that neighborhood today there are two streets. One is Olympiad Drive, and the other is Athenian Way. Now, the two most obvious intersections between Culver City and the 1932 games involved the film industry and the Helms Bakeries. I mentioned earlier that Garland, when he was proposing that Los Angeles host the games, really talked up the movie industry. And the movie industry was quite involved in the festivities that surrounded the games. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Mary Pickford, who at the time were married to each other and who were stars for the Triangle Motion Picture Company in Culver City, were instrumental in promoting the games and entertaining athletes and dignitaries during the event. And in fact, they hosted a formal dinner at their cutely named mansion in Beverly Hills, which was called the Pickford Mansion, for members of the International Olympic Committee, the National Olympic Committees, the International Sports Federation, and the Organizing Committee. A few days earlier than that, Louis B. Mayer had hosted a lunch at the MGM studios in Culver City for IOC members, their wives, and selected past Olympic champions. And that event included not only the lunch, but a tour of the facility or of the studio for the dignitaries, who got to see several movies being made, including that starred, among others, John and Ethel Barrymore and John Huston. The other Culver City connection in '32 was the Helms Bakeries. The Helms Bakeries opened in 1931 under the leadership of Paul Helms. Helms had been a coxswain for the rowing team at Syracuse University and had a lifelong interest in sports. And he took full advantage of the 1932 games by applying for and winning the contract to supply baked goods to the Olympic Village. He won that competition and immediately declared Helms bread as the official bread of the Olympic Games. So this is the bakery, and as you will see, Helms also took the Olympic logo, the Olympic motto, Citius Altius Fortius. It took the American Olympic Committee logo and took the words official and Olympic and put them together. And he legally registered all of those trademarks because the American Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Committee, in their wisdom, had failed to do so. So all of this, of course, gave the Helms Bakery a great deal of publicity, and it also affiliated the Helms brand with the largest cultural event in Southern California history. I mentioned earlier that 1932 produced a lot of Olympic firsts, but perhaps the most significant thing about the 32 games in terms of Olympic history is that despite taking place in the Great Depression, and despite attracting fewer nations and athletes than the 1928 Games in Amsterdam had, the Los Angeles Games established the Olympics as a mega event. It established the Olympic Games as a large-scale international event with dramatic appeal that captured the attention of the world. In the lead-up to the Games, the organizing committee ran a sophisticated public relations and communications campaign that sent regular Olympic updates to media outlets throughout the world, printed in 6 different languages, and also used a volunteer army of 1,500 amateur ham radio operators in Southern California to push the Olympic message throughout the world to their counterparts. The 1932 Games, therefore, represented a significant leap in the magnitude or the scale of the Olympic Games. The 1932 stadium was far bigger than any stadium that had existed up until that point. I mean, the biggest Olympic stadium that had existed up until that point. The total ticket sales were double any previous games, and more media representatives attended the 32 games than ever before. Now, there's a tendency to treat the 32 Olympic Games and the 1984 Olympic Games as two essentially disconnected events. But in fact, there is a real linear relationship between the two. The 1932 Games, for example, fired the imagination of a group of Southern California citizens led by Garland and Paul Helms, who formed something with the encouragement of the American Olympic Committee called the Southern California Committee for the Olympic Games, or SOCOG. And beginning in the 1940s, SOCOG bid every 4 years for every Olympic Games between 1940 and the late 70s, when Los Angeles was awarded the 84 Games. So this had the effect of keeping the Olympic conversation alive in Southern California. But SOCOG's bids were not the only Olympic activities that occurred in Southern California between the two games. In fact, Culver City played a key role in keeping the Olympic flame alive during that period, and the Helms Bakeries were at the center of this activity. In 1936, the Helms Bakeries funded the establishment of the Helms Athletic Foundation. The Helms Athletic Foundation was a joint venture of Paul Helms and a man named Bill Schroeder. And it was a visionary organization. Today, sports museums and halls of fame are commonplace. The International Sports Heritage Association has more than 130 institutional members. But in 1936, the only institution similar to Helms was the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, which also was founded in 1936. So the Helms Foundation ran halls of fame in several sports. It sponsored banquets, awards, a museum, and a library. Here we go again. The Helms Hall, which was where this foundation was located, was on the same plot of land as the bakery, and you can see it here during its construction. If you're driving east on Venice, it is the last structure that you will see on that property. It's still there today, and it looks like this. Now, one of the most Olympic-oriented things that Helms did was to award the annual World Trophy to the outstanding amateur athlete from each continent. And at that time, because the Olympics were officially an amateur competition, it meant that almost every single winner of the Helms Trophy Award was an Olympian. And as a result, the Helms Foundation became something of a hangout for Olympians. It was a gathering place for Olympians. And this 1950 photo, I think, illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. So I don't know how well this shows up, but in the center you see Duke Kahanamoku and Johnny Weissmuller, who were swimming stars of the 1920s and also water polo players. And also in that photograph are 7 other Olympians and 2 Olympic coaches. The Helms Bakery, during this period, also continued to commercially exploit its Olympic bread. And this really explicit branding campaign led to a long-term conflict with the American Olympic Committee President Avery Brundage, as well as the IOC, who objected to the commercial use of the word Olympic, the use of the rings, the use of the motto, the use of the logo. They hated everything about it. The dispute took several years to resolve and stretched from the late 30s into the early 1950s. In the end, Helms, who was on very firm legal ground but also loved the Olympic movement, agreed to drastically reduce the use of Olympic wording and imagery in his bread packaging and on his trucks. The Helms Bakeries, I'm sure you all know, was sent delivery trucks to people's homes all over Southern California. So he got rid of that kind of branding, but he kept the signs on the building, and it didn't, and the agreement that Paul Sr. had developed with Avery Brundage didn't prevent Paul Jr. in 1965 from entering this float, which says Helms Olympic bread in the Rose Parade. So the Helms Bakeries, whose business, as I said a moment ago, was based on truck deliveries to households, became less profitable as time went on and as supermarkets began to develop, and ceased operations in 1969. A couple of years after that, the Marx family bought the property and began the process that converted that property from a bakery to what it is today. And that sale was the beginning of the end for the Helms Athletic Foundation, which lost its funding and which spent the 1970s looking for other locations and other benefactors. As the Helms Foundation struggled to remain viable, SOCOG, the Southern California Committee for the Olympic Games, continued to push for the return of the Olympic Games to Los Angeles. The committee finally achieved success in 1977 when, under the leadership of this man, John Argue, the U.S. Olympic Committee, by one vote, selected Los Angeles over New York City to represent the United States as the American bid city. So there was a point in Olympic history where any city, regardless of where it was located, could bid for the Games. But by this time, the IOC had made a rule that a country could only put forth one city. So the city that got put forward in 1977 was Los Angeles. Now, as you may, if those of you who are old enough to remember, as I am, the late 1970s, the prospect of a city hosting the Games was not particularly attractive. The massacre of Israeli athletes and coaches at the 1972 Munich Games and the boycotts and the cost overruns of the 1976 Montreal Games resulted in almost no city wishing to host the 1984 Games. Tehran had expressed some initial interest, but in the unrest that preceded the overthrow of the Shah and the assumption of power by Ayatollah Khomeini, Tehran dropped by the wayside. And as a result, Los Angeles was the only city that made a bid to the International Olympic Committee to host the '84 Games. So inevitably, in May of 1987, the IOC provisionally awarded the Games to Los Angeles. The award was provisional because the IOC wanted the city of Los Angeles, as had always happened, to underwrite or to financially guarantee the success of the Games. However, Los Angeles voters in a citywide referendum in 1978 said, absolutely not, we're not going to spend tax money on that. So that led to a standoff with the IOC, and eventually the IOC blinked, and in 1979, the International Olympic Committee accepted a deal whereby the United States Olympic Committee would financially guarantee the Games, which was kind of a joke because the USOC at that time didn't have nearly enough money to do that. But, you know, it made everybody look good. They signed the papers, and the Games came to Los Angeles. So as was the case in 1932, Culver City had a couple of very close connections to the Games in 1984. And the first one was a competitive connection. The marathon races went through Culver City, as you've already heard. Unlike 1932, which featured only a men's marathon race, both men and women competed in '84. In fact, 1984 was the first time that women had competed in the Olympic marathon, and that has led many people to sort of credit the Los Angeles Olympic Committee, Olympic Organizing Committee, with implementing that change. But the truth is the LAOOC resisted that change, particularly in the beginning, and it was only because advocates of women's sport refused to take no for an answer that the LAOOC and the IOC eventually agreed to add the event. Now, one of the factors that paved the way, I don't know why it does that. If anybody knows. Anyway, one of the factors that paved the way for the Olympic women's marathon was that by the late 70s and the early 1980s, women had competed often enough in marathons that neither the IOC nor anyone else could pretend that women were incapable of running a distance of 26.2 miles. And one of the races that helped dispel the myth that women were too fragile to run the marathon was the Western Hemisphere Marathon held here in Culver City. The starting point of that race, in fact, was right here at this building. The race would then go to the ocean, basically turn around and come back. And it was a nice flat course, and it was a fast course. The race began in 1948 and was run the first year in Los Angeles over the 1932 Olympic course, but in 1949 it moved here to Culver City, and it remained here until its demise in 2001. In its prime, the race was considered one of the biggest marathons in the United States, and in 1964, it was the course for the U.S. Olympic trials. The first female winner of the Western Hemisphere's marathon was a woman named Mary Lepper. Lepper is shown here on your left, and she's shown there with her training partner, Lynn Carmen. So they decided in 1993 that they would enter this race. That was several years, I should add, before women ran at Boston. And prior to the race, one of the race officials tried to intimidate them into not running. It's according to at least one report, there was somebody who tried to remove them from the course shortly after the race started, and reportedly Carmen shouted out, "I have the right to use public streets for running." Carmen would go on to win other marathons, but she dropped out of the 1963 race. Lepper, however, finished in a time of 3 hours, 37 minutes, and 7 seconds. The Lepper story was picked up by the media and reported by a local sports writer named David Davis a few years ago, and that in turn led to the Culver City issuing a proclamation praising or recognizing Lepper's accomplishment. And I don't need to read the whole thing, but you can see it there. What it says at the end is, she is a shining example of how one person can overcome tremendous hurdles to fulfill a dream and in the process pave the way for generations to come. Following Lepper's run, it was several years before other women competed in the Western Hemisphere Marathon, but in the 1970s, a Southern California runner named Jacqueline Hansen won the race 3 times, and including the 1974 race in which she set the world's record. And Jacqueline is here today, and I would ask Jacqueline to stand up and be recognized. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Jacqueline in her career won 11 marathons, is that right? 12 out of 15 marathons. Including Boston in 1974. She has won races, big races, at every distance from 1 mile to the marathon to 50 miles. She's been an activist for women's sports. She has served on a number of committees and commissions, and she's also been a very successful coach. So we're glad to have you here. Thank you. So in '84, as I said, both men and women ran the marathon. Each race started at Santa Monica College. It went down the coast to Marina del Rey, turned inland, came up through Culver City on Jefferson Boulevard before turning to the east and heading to the finish at the Coliseum. Carlos Lopez of Portugal won the men's race, and Joan Benoit, an American runner from Maine, won the women's marathon. And as an aside, I should note that last year, Joan Benoit Samuelson, who is the second from your left, second from my left too, so I don't know why I have to turn around, but anyway, who's from the second from the left, was inducted into the Los Angeles Coliseum Court of Honor. If you've ever been to the Coliseum, you will have noticed those big bronze plaques that have people's pictures on them and some verbiage underneath them. That's what the Court of Honor is. And Joan and another Olympian named Anita DeFrance, who also worked for the organizing committee and is an IOC member, were inducted. And that was a noteworthy occasion because they were the first women and only the second and third women to be inducted, or women athletes to be inducted into the Court of Honor in its 60-year history. The last one was Babe Diedrichson in 1961. The other way that Culver City contributed to the 1984 games was by serving as a location for the LAOOC, the Los Angeles Olympic Organizing Committee offices. The LAOOC began its operations in Century City and then moved to UCLA in Westwood. But in 1983, at the point where its full-time staff grew above 500, it moved into a former Hughes helicopter assembly facility in Culver City near the corner of Washington and Lincoln, which is where Costco is today, right? And Verizon. And by the way, have you been to that store? Oh my God. These next three pictures will show you the interior of the what was called the Marina Center. It was a 180,000 square foot facility that provided 20 conference rooms, a 2,000 line telephone switchboard, a cafeteria, and a company store. The Marina Center also featured what in the day was cutting-edge office technology, including something that was new to almost all of the staff, something called email. So I could stop here, but there is one other twist to the Culver City Olympic story. The 1984 games, as you know, produced a surplus. The surplus was about $234 million. That surplus was split with 60% of it going to the United States Olympic Committee for the development of elite athletes. The remaining 40% was used to create the Amateur Athletic Foundation here in Southern California. And the foundation eventually changed its name to the LA84 Foundation, which is the name it has today, and it has had and still has really two missions. One is to support youth sports in Southern California, and the other is to educate the public about the role of sport in society. And the foundation met the second part of its mission by deciding to create a sports library that the foundation board of directors envisioned would become, to use their words, an institution of national and international significance. In 1988, the foundation completed construction of a new building on its property, which is in West Adams in Los Angeles. And at the time, that building was meant to provide space for books, artifacts, and for meetings. And the collections that were in the library, the artifacts and the book collections that were in the library when the library opened, came entirely from the Helms Athletic Foundation. That was the genesis of the collection. It's grown significantly since then, but that was the beginning of it. The library in recent years has transitioned from a paper-based library to an online library. I don't know how well that shows up, but that's our search page for the library. And last year, researchers from around the world made 6 million page downloads from that collection. And I'm happy to tell you that one of the most heavily used parts of the collection remains the old Olympic publications inherited from the Helms Foundation that was created here in Culver City in 1936. So thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions, and if you want to direct questions to anybody who volunteered or was an Olympian or ran the Western States Marathon, please feel free to do so. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yes.
You had mentioned in your presentation about the idea of making profit from the Olympics.
Yeah.
And how it was somewhat difficult to get cities to take on the task.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, do you have a position at all about the idea of placing the Olympics, both summer and winter, at a permanent location as opposed to changing
I think it probably, I understand the argument behind it, but I think it probably would not be a good idea, and I don't think there's any chance, although I may be wrong, that the IOC would do it. The International Olympic Committee really wants the Games to be a worldwide phenomenon, and it wants to expand its footprint. And so I think that, the Games going to Rio and the Games being considered for Africa in the future, the games going to Asia, including the Winter Games, is all part of a desire on the part of the IOC to see the games spread out. Other people have argued that, that whatever innovations we've seen in the Olympic movement and in the staging of the games are precisely because it's not the same people at the same place running the games every time around. But the games have become extraordinarily expensive to organize. You still are not seeing a great number of cities lining up to bid for them. One of the reasons that Los Angeles won the 28 bid was because really there weren't too many other cities that were interested in doing it. So they made a deal, the IOC made a deal whereby Paris would take the 24 games, which marks the 100-year anniversary of the 1924 games in Paris, and Los Angeles took the 2028 games. But there have been a number of cities, particularly in Western Europe and particularly in democracies, that have said, no, this is just not worth the effort, it's not worth the money, we're not going to do it. So I think it's an open question, but my position on it is that I don't think it would be a good thing. I'd like to see the games go to Africa, for example. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I had occasion to serve as mayor of Culver City in 1984.
Yeah.
And as I recall, one of the concerns that we had with regard to the Olympics was traffic.
Mm-hmm.
And there were many people, friends of mine, who were looking to rent their homes to escape the traffic. As it turns out, traffic is never better than during the Olympics.
Yeah.
I had a question for you. I seem to, did you know Sid Cronenthal?
Yeah.
Sid was our Park and Recreation Director.
Yep.
I had occasion to be invited by him to an event at a mansion on West Adams Boulevard. I can't remember exactly what the occasion was, but I know it was an event celebrating a pre-Olympic party.
That was us.
You know much about
Yeah, so that is where we are now. So what happened was, I mentioned in my presentation that the Helms collection, the Helms Foundation, throughout the 70s was looking for locations and benefactors. So Citizen Savings Bank for a while funded the foundation at a location near the airport. But later in the 70s, Peter Uberoth decided he wanted to solve this problem, and so he had somebody scout around for properties, and that person found a property at 2141 West Adams, and the Uberoth Family Foundation purchased the house, and then, or I'm not saying this correctly, but to cut to the chase, First Interstate Bank sort of picked up the expense and created the First Interstate Bank Amateur Athletic Foundation at that location. So the event that you went, and that operated there until our foundation came along and we inherited all of that. So the event that you went to almost certainly was right there where we are today. With regard to traffic, one of the things that the organizers claimed in '84 was that the volume of traffic really was not significantly less during the Olympic Games, but what they were able to do was, through voluntary programs with some of the bigger employers in town, was to spread out deliveries and work hours, and so that the traffic was more evenly distributed during the day and you didn't have a crush early in the morning and late in the afternoon. Jeannie?
You're so humble about your role in the library at the foundation.
I didn't do nothing.
Your years of just dedicated and unbelievable service made it the library that the world knows is the biggest sports library ever, and you had so much to do with that.
Thank you.
Really, you and your staff.
Good, thank you.
I'd also like to hear from Jacqueline, and it might piggyback with the traffic issue about the demise of the marathon that was just really the pinnacle of North America, and it was such a fast course, it was a beautiful course, and I'm wondering if traffic had anything to do with that. I don't know what, Jacqueline, maybe you could talk to us about that.
Well, excuse excuse me, I was inspired to run my first marathon because I witnessed a woman in 1971 named Cheryl Bridges become the first woman to break 250 in the world, set a world record. That was the first marathon I ever watched. She was my teammate. So she was the woman who inspired me. So she was the first world record holder, then I was the first to break 240, and my teammate Nikki Gorman also set a world record on that course. The course was like the West Coast Boston. It was the longest consecutively run marathon, in the world. The way I envision it, this is just from my perspective, it seemed like in the 80s when running began to go professional and prize money, appearance money, was on the table, that Boston decided to keep two committees. They kept the BAA, which exists today for preserving the history, and the race committee that did the fundraising and getting the sponsorship and flying in elite athletes and coming up with prize money, and the two work in parallel universes, and Boston is obviously the most successful, one of the most successful marathons in the world, one of the few major marathons, and the Culver City Marathon did not go that route, and it just kind of died on the vine. And I think that with the LA Marathon coming in was the knife in the back that just finished it off. So that's basically my perspective, and I think it's very sad because it was such a rich history. I mean, Mexico, Japan oftentimes held their Olympic trials here. We had a sister city in Japan. It was, it was a thriving, wonderful event. I'm very sad to see it. I'm sad to see its demise.
And Sid Cronenthal's name came up. Did you?
Oh, I know Sid very well. Oh my gosh, Sid, was he the first race director? He was the only race director I ever knew. My late husband was older than I am, so he had run the marathon many, many, many years. While I was sitting there, I was actually not texting. I was actually pulling up a picture of Bill Schroeder receiving my shoes after the world record and putting them in that hall, and my Adidas rep handing me a new pair of shoes as I handed off to Bill. I got a new pair. I still own my world record shoes, but my second world record, but the first world record shoes are somewhere in the collection. Question?
Well, I wanted to comment about the Western Hemisphere Marathon, which I ran a couple of times. And one of the reasons why it failed or was discharged was because, as you know, the marathon went out towards the beach, came back. But at 20 miles, you had to go past the finish line.
I know that
and dig a
very
loop,
well.
right?
Yeah, it's hard
So
to go
that
back out.
Right, so that was very hard. But I think it had to do with getting participants at the time. It was a great race, and Sid Cronenthal, of course, as you said, was behind that.
Oh, he was the driving force. He really was the driving force. I remember one of the last race director, Cheryl Ankers, but she didn't get to fulfill the race. They decided to cut it off because it was looking like a money loser. But I always felt that we could have turned it into an ekiden, an ekiden is a Japanese marathon run in relay. And I always felt that maybe if we had had a division for relay teams, that it would have been way more popular. 4 people running approximately 10K each, or as they do in Japan, they alternate 5K, 10K, and it adds up to a marathon. And I felt that would have drawn a bigger crowd, but she never really got that opportunity. And I thought that might have saved it. Fewer people want to run a whole marathon by themselves, but a lot of people would like to run a marathon in relay for sure. So it's just sad. Maybe we can bring it back.
Jacqueline, you were in Boston on Monday for the...
I just got back last night. Yeah.
What do you have to say about that?
I'm so happy to be home in sunny California.
I just have to say, I am so impressed with your research. I am so happy because I'm the city historian in Culver City. And Sid Grunenthal was a great part of all of our lives. After Sid died, we had the job in the Historical Society of going through a lot of his things. And now I'm even more glad that we sent a lot to you. And your people came down and went through with us, and we sent it to you. And I congratulate you for the fine work you do.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. I have a question. I just remembered that there was the Soviets weren't allowed to participate in the Olympics in '84. So I really don't have a question, but I was wondering, how much in advance was that announced, and how did it affect the committee?
Well, it's not that the Soviets were not allowed to compete, it's that they chose to boycott, as we chose to boycott the 1980 games. Jan, you work for the committee. Maybe you could answer that a bit more effectively than I could. But part of the answer to the question is that there were people in the committee who were assigned the responsibility of making sure that anybody that wasn't officially boycotting did show up. Do you want to talk about the relay and the response? Because I think the boycott, I think, was announced right about the start of the relay in New York, when the relay was beginning in New York.
Oh, the torch relay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, the events were unfolding as they did with 1980, when, and this was felt to be it was retaliatory. And I think that what's the reality of the Olympic movement that doesn't seem to be, or hadn't been prior, really widely accepted, was the level of politics and the intertwining of the sort of national agendas that go along with the Olympic movement. And that's a parallel that's going along with the day-to-day training that athletes go through and the actual spectacle and the competition, because that's genuine. But there is this whole other parallel part of it. And for the 1984 games, we actually had staff. We had, I think there were 10 Olympians on staff, which was unprecedented. And part of the reason for that was not only to get our perspective as former participants in the games that could inform the operations and make things better for the athletes, but in addition, we were able to have some insights on how international sport operates. A couple of the athletes were assigned the task of working with those countries that looked like they were going to follow the boycott that was initiated by the USSR. And unfortunately, there were a lot of companies that followed along. By the way, in '76 there was a boycott as well, and there was one also. I think it was in 52, around the Hungarian invasion. The Russian invasion of Hungary, and it turned out that the director, the president of the International Rowing Federation, actually didn't compete in the Olympic Games when he should have in 1952 because Switzerland had boycotted. So this wasn't the first time. And but with 1984, yeah, the timing was meant to be as harmful as it could have been, which was around the launch of the torch relay. And in addition, there was a lot of resource put to trying to bring the countries along. An example would be, I worked in the sports division, and I oversaw the planning for Lake Casitas for rowing and canoe kayak. I happened to be trained in sports management as well, so that was my profession. My qualification wasn't just having been a competitor. But we had, each of the sport managers was assigned the task of working with those countries' delegations who would be coming to the Olympic Games, hopefully. And in particular, we went to meetings of the international federations and had essentially to lobby the representatives from those different countries. So one of the countries that ended up from the Eastern Bloc that actually did not go along with the boycott was Romania. But they were cagey. When they decided that they would participate, they negotiated an unbelievable deal. There were airplanes that were chartered to bring them and all of their equipment, and in rowing it's a lot. All those boats and oars and a lot of stuff. So they had brought all that stuff, but what happened was they also wanted to rent equipment. I'm just giving you the example of rowing. And so what they did is they brought really crappy equipment. It was old equipment. And, but they got to race in really good equipment, and then all that stuff was left behind. So, but the benefit was we actually got to give it to some rowing programs in Southern California, so it did find a home, but it was difficult. But that's the kind of effort that was going on, and it was going on for months, and right up until the start of the games. And with the Romanians, it just, not only the rowing team, but other sports had negotiated all kinds of deals to get their equipment and all of them there at no cost, essentially, to the Romanian federations or to the Olympic Committee in Romania.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
It's been said that Hollywood feeds the world. Can you maybe elaborate on some of the involvement by Louis B. Mayer, who ran Metro for the 32 Olympics, as well as some of the Hollywood influence for the 84 Olympics, especially the opening ceremonies, which I believe was produced by David Wolper, as well as the closing ceremonies. That was literally an all-star cast.
Yeah. Well, as you say, Wolper did produce the opening ceremonies, and Wolper was, I believe, on the board of directors of the Los Angeles Olympic Organizing Committee, and he also ended up on our board of directors as well. I don't know what to say about David other than that I do remember when the foundation built its new library, we had a flame, an Olympic flame. It wasn't the Olympic flame, but we had a flame that we called the Olympic flame. And it was kind of to the side of the building and behind a couple of bushes, and Wolper, in his typical fashion, says, "You've got to move that fucking flame now." Is that going on the internet? All right. But he says, "You got So we, at a great deal of cost, we had an architect design a new flame and put it right in the middle of our courtyard, which leads to another story. We, I believe, invited Juan Antonio Samaranch, who was the president of the IOC, to come to the foundation as we unveiled this new Olympic flame, which we called the Helix because it looked like a helix DNA. And Bill Dwyer, who was the sports editor of the LA Times, came to the event and was, going around with his wine and cheese, and somebody introduced him to the woman who had been the architect of the library and who had also designed this flame. And Bill says to her, "So how much did this cost?" And she goes, "Well, that's kind of between me and the client." And he goes, "So, like, was it an outrageous cost? I mean, why won't you tell me?" And she goes, "Well, I mean, it was like $50,000 or whatever it was." And so he kind of goes on his way and she goes on her way, and she circles back about 5 minutes later and says, "You're not going to print that, are you?" And Bill goes, "You're new at this, aren't you?" He didn't print it. Yes, Ryan.
So I was hoping to involve LA 2028 to some degree, but is there anything you can share in terms of any planning or anything from what they're planning, and specifically in regards to youth sports training looking towards future Olympics?
Well, I would say, first of all, I don't know if there will be any events coming through Culver City in '84, so I don't know if like the road race and cycling or the marathon will do that. They have announced pretty much what their venues are, and they have these concentrations of sport venues within the greater Los Angeles area. With regard to youth sports, as some of you may know, when Los Angeles was awarded the games, part of the deal with the IOC was that the IOC would make an interest-free loan of $160 million to be spent spent between now and between now and 2028 to fund youth sports in Los Angeles, and specifically in the city of Los Angeles. And so that money, it looks like it will be funneled to the City Rec and Parks Department, and they have been working for months on a plan to spend that. I don't know what that does to their budget. It's an interest-free loan, but it's still a loan, and what it may do is have the effect of just taking $160 million out of their contingency. I'm not exactly sure how they're planning to pay for it. But the City Rec and Parks Department is full of good people, and I think they'll probably spend the money pretty well. So it should be a real boost to youth sports in the city of Los Angeles. Anything else? Yes, sir.
You said that Paris is celebrating their 100th in 2024. LA should have waited until 2032. I didn't know that it was, 100
Yeah, I think they were taking it while the getting was good. They really wanted 24, but yeah.
Helms Hall of Fame, do they have anything in it? That building?
Not now, no. Does anybody know what it's used for now?
That's owned by Mark.
Is it? Yeah, I don't know.
The helmsman is down at Berkeley and Delray. Oh, that's the Mark. Oh, yeah. I remember that as a kid.
Yeah, almost all of that material came to us. The artifact. No, not to my knowledge.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Anything else? Yes, sir.
What is the biggest prize that you have at your library? The biggest item?
The 1904, we have a gold medal from the 1904 Olympic Games, and it's worth a lot of money. I'll just say that.
The biggest might be the Sam the Eagle costume.
Oh, physically the biggest. Yeah, maybe Sam the Eagle. Yeah, but the most valuable is that, and we have I'm going to get this wrong, but we have a book from maybe we actually, when we had our library catalog, we used to actually have something that, we had a field that said oldest book in the collection, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but I think it was a golf book that was really old. It was from Scotland. It was a book of Scottish laws in which it said, basically, you can't play golf because, if everybody plays golf, they won't be able to defend the kingdom for the king. So.
You still have the World Trophy?
We still have the World Trophy, which is also, in terms of weight, is probably the heaviest thing that we have, yeah. So the World Trophy, I don't know, I call it the World Phallus. I mean, so there's this big trophy, and that's not going on the internet either. So when the Helms Foundation began doing the award, it retrospectively went back and gave the award for previous years as well. So, the trophy is filled up with people's names for each continent. And when our foundation began in the 80s, we revived the World Trophy for a few years. But what we found was that because people now are professional athletes and train and compete year-round, it was very hard to ever get all 5 winners, and we never got all 5 winners there. And so we would get 2 winners or 3 winners, but never 4 and never 5. We did get some interesting people. We got Susan Butcher, who won the Iditarod one year, and she brought along her sled dog, her lead sled dog with her. That was cool. I like that. The last year we awarded it, Lance Armstrong won it, and it's probably a good year to end it. So. Yes.
Sorry to ask another question.
That's quite all right.
Do you know what was the design company that did all the designs for the LA84 Olympics? Because they did a really good job.
Yeah. So there actually were 2 or 3 waves of design. The first design that was that the committee commissioned was the Stars in Motion logo, which was red, white, and blue. The next design was Sam the Eagle, the official mascot, which was red, white, and blue. At that point, the committee brought in a company called Sussman and Preza, and what they wanted to do was have a whole different concept that was not jingoistic or nationalistic, but was much more welcoming to an international audience. And they developed this design, which I think you're talking about, which I think originally was called the mariachis or mariachi federalism, but because that was considered politically incorrect, they called it festive federalism. But it was all these unusual geometric shapes with pastel colors, and the idea there was to create a look that could be put up relatively inexpensively and would tie together all of the Olympic venues. I may have this number wrong, but I think the committee used to say that the games were spread out over 1,400 square miles, or maybe it was 2,400 square miles, but it was a lot of square miles. And so they wanted to create a look that would immediately identify a venue as being part of the Olympic Games. And so the company was called Sussman and Preza. Preza, if I'm not mistaken, also designed the Mall of America, Fashion Island, and West Side Pavilion, and Universal City Walk. Is that right? Paul Preza? Yeah.
And Deborah Sussman did some of the design on some of the stuff that came when Culver City was kind of making a turn.
Palm tree surrounds, for one.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Some stuff that's kind of funny.
Well, great. Thank you for your attention.
So Ryan, okay, before we go, well, no, you can just, thank you. Okay, so it's time for the 50/50, so get your tickets out. Those of you that purchased tickets, we took in 140, so you're gonna win $70. And Wayne, in the spirit of the Olympics, will pick the gold medalist.
Read this.
Okay, yes, read that.
All right. Bingo. Here's the number, 975646.
Is it yours, Will?
There we
Okay.
go.
All right then. Let me just check. Okay. Thank you.